It's as much excitement as you're ever going to get out of me on video. Sorry.
College football nerds, we are back for the second week of the preseason, and we're not going to say the other word, but that's where we've been, and now we're back because the season is drawing near. We noticed in the comments from our show last week that a lot of y'all said when the nerds are back, that means college football is right around the corner, and that is true. I got Josh with me. We're going to get nerdy with y'all. We got a few topics to discuss, and since we're doing this long-form thing with a really long show, and then we cut it up, for those of y'all who don't want to watch the whole thing, I'll kind of give y'all a heads up. We're going to talk about Lane Kiffin's NIL comments. We're going to talk about why head coaches who are also play callers aren't winning national championships. We're going to do a couple of previews, Ohio State and Alabama, if their time permits. We're going to talk about that Pac-12 TV deal that they're searching for as well. All right, Josh, let's get into this first. At the SEC Media Days this week, Lane Kiffin mentioned something that, we take victory laps for good things, but also for bad things because it's kind of what I told you so. We've been saying for years now that NIL, in the form that it ultimately will be without any guardrails, is just pay for play. It's just an inducement for players to come, straight out of high school, straight to you. It's not, hey, let me put your name on this water bottle and sell it, or let you do an ad on a commercial after you've established yourself as a college player and sell it. It's an inducement. Pair that with the transfer portal, and Lane Kiffin says we got free agency. And he made another point that we loved to talk about in the past, in that the NFL doesn't have this. No professional sport has this, because people always like to compare college sports to pro sports. And this is one thing where people magically don't want to compare, because those pro players have contracts. Lane Kiffin has a contract. So we hear a lot of times, well, the coach is mad about NIL, but he's making all this money and he can walk out and go to another school. He can't. He's got a contract. So there's a downside to just moving wherever you want to move. So, Josh, with a coach like Lane Kiffin, he admitted he's using NIL to get these players out of the transfer portal, and they're heavy on the transfer portal. What do you think about the schools that maybe can't afford to do this? Is there a way that they can compete in modern college football, or are we really just relying and hoping that something comes out of this legislative announcement that we heard this week, where there's 3 senators, the bipartisan bill that's coming to kind of regulate this stuff?
It's the same reality we've talked about for a while, which is everyone's going to play this game, even if they don't want to. If you're someone in college football right now, you're either going to use collectives to pay money to players and essentially a pay-for-play model, or you're not going to be able to compete. And this is where a lot of people on different sides have differing arguments, right? A lot of people that are player advocates, which some are player advocates, a lot of which are really just agents that say they're player advocates is a fancier, nicer name. They would say that the players are the ones that should really benefit from the system. And so this is all really good because it's ensuring that the players get the money. And if you make these changes, well, then players aren't going to get the money. I saw a tweet from On3 where the head of On3 was talking about how there isn't enough talk on these legislative changes changing the system, because it's going to, if you get rid of collectives, it's going to change the nature of football where the money is no longer going to the players. That was one way to view the angle of the current system is pay for play, right? The reason these players are getting the money they're getting is that schools are just throwing money at them to get them to go to a program. Kiffin's point is everyone's forced to play in this system. And his ultimate point, which is the same one we've already made many, many times, is that it's not really sustainable, right? That the biggest schools are going to always be the ones that have the biggest pots of money to pay players the most. And yeah, if you're the starting quarterback now at Notre Dame, and, let's say you transferred for a school, I don't know, let's call it Wake Forest, you probably got a lot of money to transfer. There's probably a collective that shelled out a lot of money for you to make that transfer, and you're probably doing pretty well. So there are some players really benefiting from the system. My criticism has been always the players really benefiting from the system are the players that go on to sign a lot of money and, big time contracts in the NFL. There was talk Bryce Young was $1 million player for Alabama. Well, he just signed, I think, a $38 million contract or something like that as the first pick of the draft. He didn't need $1 million in college. The players that everyone says are really struggling and need financial help, the majority of them are not superstars for Alabama. They're the starting right guard for University of Louisiana Monroe, or their backup lineman for a team, and they're freshmen coming out of high school and they've got difficult situations in their home lives, they're not getting money from this. So I think what Kiffin's really echoing is what we've always said, right? You've got this whole structure, you've got this world where everybody's competing, and then ultimately our real concern is when you combine all those issues with the transfer portal, it makes it so much more toxic. Because when the transfer portal, now you can buy players from other lesser schools. So even if you land a high-level prospect and you develop him, he's just going to take the money and go, again, maybe say Wake Forest to Notre Dame and be the starting quarterback. And, the Wake Forest, the Georgia Techs, I don't know, Oregon State's is another example. Their schools are always going to struggle for the rest of the time. They're never going to have high-end players. You're probably never going to see a Kenny Pickett at Pitt again. He's going to leave. Same way Addison left for USC. And I think that's going to disenfranchise a huge amount of the sport. And I think Kiffin's ultimate point, which he talked about at length, is the thing that we've harped on since day one, which is you can talk about fairness in sports. No, if you want college to be like a professional sport, you have to at least acknowledge no professional sport operates in this way. There is no American sport where you can pay any player whatever you want to play him to leave to play for any school at any time. And really that problem is the thing that makes the whole system break and really creates the big danger for the competitive, entertaining.
There is a potential positive, and I want you to talk about collective bargaining in a second, and that's what it is. Like if we can get some collective bargaining, maybe through some sort of legislation, because right now it is just whoever can go the hardest in the paint and get the most players. But like you said, it doesn't work. And I'll give some examples that are analogs to professional sports that I don't want to see happen in college, and I think might be happening a little bit. So if any of y'all are Florida Marlins fans out there, I think you'll remember there's a certain championship, World Series that the Marlins won, and immediately after, ownership completely gutted the team. So they spent some money, even though they didn't want to spend any of their own money. They wanted to use public money on their stadium. They spent some money on their team to get it to where it could win a World Series. They did that in combination with a good farm system for a short term. And then when they got players that were, good enough to win, they won and they let it all go. And then they have had a hard time recovering since then. Another analog to professional sports is the max QB contract. And I think we're seeing this a little bit maybe in USC. Now, I think if USC can parlay this year into a playoff bid, it'll generate some momentum to get some more dollars coming back through. But if they spent anywhere near the reported numbers they spent to get Addison, we know what they spent on Lincoln Riley. We feel like they've been spending a lot on NIL to kind of build a short-term team and sort of skip that developmental phase. If they can't win this year, I think that we might see them not only regress to the mean, but even further back, because the donors that put millions of dollars in the system see that it didn't buy them a championship. It maybe didn't buy them a playoff appearance. Then you're going to have that money dry up, which is like a really quick way to put your program in a hole. This might happen at A&M as well. We don't know the dollar figure of what they spent on that one class, but it does seem like, just based on the feeling out there, that maybe they're not spending as much now. And I think that maybe it's just because it's short term, and we're trying to learn as a space, a collective space in here, what to do. But to me, it seems like there are unintended consequences even for the teams that are shelling out the dollars. Now, Josh, if we bring this back, and there is some legislation, because everybody thinks this legislation is the boogeyman because we're getting government involved in sports, and that's really bad. You made a good point on Twitter this week about what's worse than government regulation in this space. So talk about that and how collective bargaining might get us out of this hole.
You have to realize the situation we're in right now is one in which everything is already regulated. The problems that we have in NIL were created because really it was the state of California and the state of Florida passed individual laws that said you weren't going to be able to limit how much compensation a college athlete was able to get through NIL or such Texas followed up, and we kind of had an escalating situation where states started passing more and more permissive laws. That there are permissive laws, I would say, were really restricting the NCAA's ability to legislate or setting grounds or boundaries on what the NCAA was or was not allowed to enforce. What you have now is a situation where the NCAA is heavily regulated by the government. There are probably 30 to 40 state laws that are all different and all telling the NCAA what they can and can't do. Because the laws are different, the NCAA can't pass a single policy, but the NCAA still is an enforcement mechanism. So you have a heavily government regulated NCAA. And I think you need to understand that when you talk about federal legislation, if you have state law and you have Supreme Court rulings that come out, and again, I always emphasize this, the Supreme Court rulings that exist were about limitations on academic supplements to players. So it was really about the ability for the NCAA to limit how much you can spend on a laptop or textbooks. It was explicitly not about pay for play. And I know Kavanaugh had a concurrence that everybody brings up, but a concurrence is not law, and it may well be Kavanaugh's sole opinion. Nobody joined it. So that means the other justices didn't necessarily think they wanted to put their name to it. It's probably not the majority opinion of the court. But you've got all this stuff floating around, state law, Supreme Court law. How do you get over it? The only way to do it is to have a federal law. A federal law will preempt all the state laws. It will preempt the Supreme Court rulings. It will set one single set of guidelines or boundaries. And in this case, it's not really about telling what the NCAA needs to do. It's going to set a set of boundaries to say, hey, NCAA, if you exist between this boundary and you pass any regulation within there, it's going to be legal. People can't sue you over it. One of NCAA's big problems is antitrust. That's what killed NCAA football that everybody, laments having gone. It's the same set of laws that's kind of created this NIL stuff. Well, now they're going to set boundaries and say if you operate within this bounds, you're going to be immune to antitrust suit. The states can't override this federal law. The Supreme Court can't override the law because everything we're dealing with is a congressional law. The Supreme Court cannot and will not override it if it's a black and letter federal law that this is what's legal, right? The antitrust stuff, none of this has been constitutional. It's been other congressional laws that are abutting NCAA regulations. So really the federal law greatly simplifies the situation, sets a single set of bounds. There are some things like they talked about the fact that players could enter the draft and be eligible if they pull back out. Obviously, you don't want the law to be too specific in a lot of areas. You want to give the NCAA leeway to pass their own regulations. I think stuff like that could be really good in basketball, but it's also really bad in football. I don't think it's practical for a lot of reasons. But it's still better than the situation we have today where right now California could pass a law that says players have to be eligible to play football if they don't go undrafted, and the NCAA would have to honor that. So if you don't want the state of California controlling your sport, you need a federal law. So that's one half of the equation. And again, there's the one that exists right now, which is a bipartisan thing. I think people on both sides dislike the Democratic or Republican guys that are presenting it, but understand it's bipartisan. There are other bills that haven't been publicly released but are being drafted. I know Tommy Tuberville, the former college coach, and Manchin, the infamous Democratic senator from West Virginia, who is a huge college football fan, good friend of Nick Saban, they have a bill that they're proposing. And I think one of those bills from some group is probably going to be reasonable, and it's probably going to be a matter of figuring out which one they're going to go with or hybridizing them. The other side of it is collective bargaining. So again, when we talk about all these issues with players, one of my big things has always been we don't need a situation where if you're the New England Patriots and Tom Brady ages out, that you can pay any dollar amount you want to go get Patrick Mahomes because you have more money than anybody else. College sports, when you talk about a market, right? Quick aside here. College sports as a market is a market as compared to the NBA, the NFL, NHL, et cetera, et cetera. People talk about the market of college sports as if we need a free market where every player can do what they need to do. No. The market is all the competing sports. The way you're successful as a sport is to be entertaining. To be entertaining, you must be competitive. That is why every sport has regulations on how players can move and trade around and all. And a big piece of that puzzle is collective bargaining, because that ensures that every player playing that sport has some measure of value from the sport, right? backup third string NFL lineman gets a significant salary, that pulls from the top end salaries in order to make that work, and it ensures everybody gets a fair amount of money, because otherwise you end up with this wacky situation, right? You end up with teams that are unbalanced where nobody wants to watch because the games aren't competitive. And you end up in a situation where the players all don't get to share equally, because the guys that are the most in demand, the top quarterbacks, are going to be able to demand whatever they want to go wherever they want to go. Teams are held hostage, and as long as someone's willing to pay that money, even if it's bad for the sport, the one individual team will make that decision. And what happens is if you get one team that pays too much money, that team, while going bankrupt, may beat everyone else so bad that they go bankrupt and the whole sport goes bankrupt. So you have to kind of create this artificial world of competitiveness that, same reason the best team drafts last and the worst team drafts first in the first round, that is designed to constantly make teams do better and worse at some level to be competitive. And the last thing I'll say on this rant is everyone's always said, well, college football is already broken as it is. The best teams are always the best teams, so how can it hurt? Well, I think what you're discovering is, yeah, the best teams were the best teams, and it was rare for another team to rise up and be a big deal. But the more we expand the playoff, the more we expand NIL, the more dominant those teams are. The best recruiting classes in history were all signed in the last 3 years. The playoff has continually produced fewer and fewer varieties of teams, more narrow pool of teams that end up being champions. Yeah, it can get worse, and we can very easily end up in a situation when there are only about 30 teams still competing, and even in that world, there may only be 3 to 5 teams that have a chance of a championship, even with only 30 teams in the pool. That's a reality that I don't want to see, and we've got to do some things to control it.
Yeah, and I'll just wrap this up too in saying what frustrates me about the whole thing is any commentary that's counter to no holds barred, no guardrails, no nothing, free for all is met with, oh, you just don't care about the players. And that is such an easy, get out of having to have a real debate kind of thing that I wish people would stop doing it. If we want to have a real discussion about what's actually best for the sport and long-term what's best for these players, including scholarships to educate thousands of kids who won't have that if most of these teams go away, then we need to stop with the knee-jerk, oh, well, you just hate the players kind of thing, because at the end of the day, if you leave some market like this completely unbridled, completely unrestrained by any kind of regulation, then you're going to get what you don't want, and we don't want that.
And I'll add one more point. Again, in the market example, what you don't want is a reality where you end up with something much more like the normal free market, where one team dominates everything. And what happens when one company dominates a market? The other companies go out of business, right? And if one team forces the other teams out of business because they paid players a lot of money, yeah, the players that got paid money today, they're going to be rich. And they're going to do really well. And they're all going to act in their own self-interest to do that. But the players 5 to 10 years from now, they're not going to have the same opportunities. There won't be as many scholarships. There won't be as many teams. And 5 to 10 years from now, those teams that all collapsed or lost all their fans, they're not going to watch football anymore, which means they're not going to support the big teams, and everything's going to crumble like a house of dominoes. So you have to be really careful, because you don't really want a free market. You don't want a world where only a few teams succeed, because you want this to be a long-term thing. You want it to be continually successful. You want it to be continually competitive. And so, yeah, it drives me nuts when people talk about not caring about the players. I care tremendously about the players, but I care as much about the players 10 years from now as I care about the players tomorrow. And that's a big difference.
Yeah. Peter Thiel famously said he loves perfect monopolies, because perfect you break monopolies or you don't allow monopolies, you get the airline industry, which has tiny margins and perfect competition, which is what we're going for. Okay, so I saw a tweet, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, Coach Dan Casey posed this question: do you want a head coach who is a play caller, or do you want a head coach who's a CEO? And Josh, kind of in my mind, I think it's cool to have a head coach play caller, especially on the offensive side of the ball. It makes you feel as a fan that there's an extra level of connectedness to what's going on the field. And it's great to see a coach in the ear of a quarterback, working through, what he's seeing on the field and things like that. But also, as a fan, you want to see your team win championships. And in the last 20 years, only one coach, I'm pretty sure, I went back and looked at this, only one coach who calls the plays has won a national championship. That's Jimbo Fisher in 2013, and he has since, we think, relinquished his play calling duties to Bobby Petrino, although he waffled a little bit this week at SEC Media Days. And Josh, even though Ohio State scored, I think 41 against Georgia in the national championship, or the maybe that was the national championship game, 40 and slip. It looks like even Day is trending to letting Hartline call the plays. I think he called him in the spring game. Hasn't formally sort of passed off the reins, but that's an offense that's very explosive and doing lots of things that are really good. But we see this work in the pros. So why is it that in the last 20 years, the only coach that's only head coach has won a national championship while calling the plays has since relinquished those duties? Why doesn't it work in college, but it works in the NFL?
I think it has a lot to do with the differences in running a college program and dealing with college players. So a college head coach really has more on his plate than an NFL head coach. And yeah, an NFL head coach sets the standard, but what are the things you got to deal with? Well, one, college players really have more distractions. They've got more going on. You have to deal with academics. You have to deal with their personal lives. You've got to deal with recruiting. Those are three things the NFL doesn't have to deal with. Yes, they've got to draft players. Drafting players is really a much, 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 much smaller problem.
And GMs are doing
than
that.
Recruiting players. Right. You've got GMs to do it. You've got talent scouts, as many as you need to help vet the players. And you have a much smaller pool of players to vet. Right? You see them in college at high-level competition. You have a general idea of how good they are. You don't have a guy at a 2A high school in Texas that no one's ever heard of that you need to watch film. There are hundreds of thousands of players in high school, and you've got to be recruiting them by their sophomore year. So it's not like you can just look at senior tape. I think a lot of casual fans don't understand how far back that goes and how much film you've got to be watching every year to catch the freshman on some small team that is blowing up and being really successful. So you can recruit him as a sophomore, so that you land him as a junior, you're on his top 5, and a senior, you got him committed. That's the process for Georgia, for Ohio State, for Alabama. That's why they recruit at the level they do. They spend a tremendous amount of time on that, just ridiculously large amount of time. Then now they've gotten a lot of analysts themselves to help with it, but still, you got coaches that have to sign off on the decisions, and you've got a really small pool of coaches, so it's a huge time sink. But also, I think the nature of running the program is different. So when in the NFL, you have professionals, right? They've got as much time as they need to prepare for the season. It is their full-time job. The practice schedules and all are pretty regimented, and it's pretty limited. But you can pretty well rely on a lot of your players, at least, knowing what they need to do, picking up the playbook, going and training on their own. In college, you got 19-year-old kids that don't have a clue how to train. They don't know how to do weightlifting. They don't have the money to do it privately. They've got to go to your school. So now you have to manage weight training programs. You got to figure out what the size is for all your defensive linemen. Do you want guys to slim up? Do you want them to get bigger? Something I've often talked about with Ed Orgeron is when he stepped in as an interim, he did really well because it was about motivating players. It was about week in, week out game management, and he was pretty solid at that. He could get a game plan together with his coaches, execute it, get the players motivated, go. Everything was great. But the other 9 months of the year, he was terrible in terms of having a nutrition plan, in terms of having a weight plan for the players, in terms of making sure discipline was right, in terms of self-evaluation on your players to make sure that you had the right players in the right positions, making sure you had good game plans for all your opponents. He was terrible, and he came into every year way behind. And you saw, at LSU, when he had that collapse after 2019, and even really in 2019, they started the season pretty rough. And in 2020 in particular, they were awful the first half of the year, and they realized, hey, we're blitzing at the lowest rate of, I think, anybody in the conference, and we have some of the most disruptive players. Maybe we should blitz. And suddenly, starting around the Alabama game, which was after their bye week, from that game through the rest of the season, they were one of the best defenses in the conference. That's the kind of stuff that a head coach in college has to do, and that's what makes a college team good. Now turn it around in the NFL, right? You've got hordes of coaches to do self-evaluation. The standard for anyone to be an assistant in the NFL is quite high. You can rely on that stuff being done at a high level. And the pool of teams you've got to scout are a lot lower. The pool of players you got to scout for the draft are lower. Plus, from a game-to-game perspective and game management, Everybody knows what they're doing. The players are so well trained and so well coached from an individual player adjustment basis. Everything's like down to inches in terms of what they're doing right or wrong. So the biggest impact is just making sure the right plays are called, that you have the right personnel in the field. And so a head coach that's focused on doing those things correctly can make a bigger impact. Where in college, I think most of the time, just making sure that your players know how to block right, catch right, run the routes right. Are they running the right option routes? Do they break the routes at the right time? Are the linemen have the right leverage? Do they have the right motivation? That stuff ends up being more important. And I think that's why you see a lot of times NFL coaches that weren't maybe weren't as good in college, or college coaches that weren't good as NFL, right? Steve Spurrier and Nick Saban were much better in college than they were in the NFL. I think Nick Saban was, sometimes people talk about being terrible in the NFL, and that may be unfair, but he's definitely a much better college coach. He's a dominant college coach. And I think he would be really good with almost any roster because of how well he manages the program. Whereas you get a lot of NFL coaches that if you could take players where the entire team is a free agent signee, and in about 2 weeks, you could have a cohesive football team with good timing and good execution, and then you could have a functional football team. So at that point, it's just about, do you have a good scheme for the players? Do you call good plays? And your ability to put that together as a head coach can turn you into a really successful program that I think maybe doesn't work the same way in college. If for no other reason than if you're calling plays and you're focusing on those things, you're necessarily not spending that time working on the minutia. And so, yeah, I think that really is the answer to the question. It's just really about the time commitments of a college coach and all the things they have to balance versus an NFL coach's ability to segment himself and focus on one thing and impact the game through that focus.
Yeah, and, even more with media days this week, Dan Mullen, not necessarily invited to media days, but during this week of discussion of SEC teams, he was on the Matt Berry show, and he kind of broke down a little bit some weaknesses of Jimbo Fisher's scheme. And I thought it was interesting because it's something that we've said for a long time. And I think it fits in with what you just said about it being hard for a college coach to really do much at the actual scheme level and in the play calling level because they don't have time. College football, offensively especially, is based on trends. We've seen it with, zone read leads to RPO, leads to going back a little bit to smash mouth football, and those trends cycle pretty quickly. So if you can't obsess about your offense and how it fits with your personnel, and you just stick with the same offense that you fine-tune a little bit, it's going to be hard to be successful in college football. And that's what Jimbo Fisher sort of kind of got the shade thrown at him from Dan Mullen, because he said, I think Jimbo, in a lot of ways, this is a quote from him, has a great system, but people have gotten on him about his ability to mix and match the system to the personnel he has. He says it can be rigid. And that's what we've always said about Jimbo Fisher. And this is why I think if he will let go and keep his hand out of the cookie jar, A&M has the chance to be good this year, Josh, because I do think that's what's been holding him back. We've seen his rigid approach, especially with quarterbacks, and the really hard throws that he has them make and the hard reads that they have to make instead of getting those easy yards. I've said it 1,000 times. Mullen's right here, and he's really right because he must watch the show. And he might know a thing or two about offense, but we know what we're talking about. He really hits the nail on the head, and I think it's because Jimbo's running a program, and he's running it pretty well. He's got to know where to allocate all that $30 million, which is a lot of work in and of itself. It's a joke, A&M fans. Leave us alone. He does have a lot to do, so I can imagine it's hard to go back and tweak and fine-tune or even wholesale change an offense. Look at how many times Nick Saban's had to change his offense while he's been in Alabama. Jimbo Fisher hasn't done that, and it probably is because of all the other demands that are on his time.
And I'll flip it around a little bit and talk about coaches that do call plays for their football teams and what that's looked like, right? One of which is Bobby Petrino. If you look at Bobby Petrino's history at different programs, and I've been on this for, 15 years, he takes a program that doesn't have a ton of talent or a lot of success, and he builds up that program until they're really successful and usually are an offensive juggernaut. But for a long time, he would do that and he'd leave. And I kept noting that when he left, usually he left the year that a lot of those guys graduated, and he left a crater. So John L. Smith at Arkansas is the example, right? Everybody remembers where Jimbo Fisher was, what was it, 2010, 2011? Those were Ryan Mallett years. They were a dominant offense. They had great receivers, but they had this group of guys they brought in. They redshirted some of them, so they had basically two classes that were compressed. And it was really when those guys were seniors combined with a few transfers that they were so good. Well, when John L. Smith took over, that was around the time I started blogging. I had flagged that I thought Arkansas was going to be a massive disappointment because basically anybody that had been anybody on that football team was gone. The whole receiving corps was gutted. The defense was totally gutted. And I think what you saw was a team that looked completely unprepared. And did John L. Smith make that worse? Yes, absolutely. But I think we saw the same thing happen at Louisville, right? When they lose Lamar Jackson. They had this big team that they built up with a lot of key pieces. But what my opinion is of Petrino as a head coach is he focused so much on building a scheme and teaching players to have that scheme, and he would build it around his personnel, that he didn't spend enough time developing those second and third string players. He didn't try to figure out what he was going to do when the starters were gone. And everybody was pushing in this direction to the scheme he wanted to build. And everybody looks at the success he had in those years, and they don't really notice, well, when those guys left, nobody else really knew how to play football on that football team. They looked totally lost. They were terrible. And that, I think you can see that with a lot of offensive-minded coaches. I think to a lesser extent, Gus Malzahn kind of had that problem. He had groups of players that would play together for multiple years, and you'd watch this improvement. And they had this cycle where about every 3 years they beat Alabama, and they would be top 5, top 10 team nationally. The next year they'd be pretty bad, and the next year they may or may not be pretty bad, and then they'd be great again. 2010, fall off in 11, 12 they were awful, they were great in 13, 14, 15, 16. Like it's just continued on through time. And I think it's because a lot of offensive-minded coaches that do a good job of instilling their scheme. Well, if you get players that are around long enough and they're running that same scheme, they adapt to it, they get pretty good, and you have a good football team. But then they haven't spent the time, the resources in developing a program, teaching the fundamentals, making sure the next crop of players are as good. Another guy I will flag in that world that this pattern has existed with through time might well be Lane Kiffin. Everybody likes Lane Kiffin. Everybody wants Lane Kiffin as a coach. We talk about what coach you'd most want to run a program. USC, he came in, installed a new offense, and they were great, taking somebody else's personnel. And then by the time he left, they were running him out of town and fired him on the airport tarmac. If you look at him when he was at Florida Atlantic, right? He came in and had built a really good football team, did really well. People don't talk about the next year when they weren't so good. Ole Miss, it's going to be curious if he can sustain success. Maybe he can by taking senior level transfers where he doesn't have to develop internally in a program. But I would be a little cautious. You may see the defense doesn't look as good this year. You may see some of the core, like offensive line blocking, core like fundamentals of the offense may fall off. That's been sort of a trend with this program. And I really think it has to do a lot with the fact that if you're a head coach and you're focused on offense and you do a good job of following those trends, you do the things that Jimbo Fisher doesn't do, you don't put your attention elsewhere. And at some point, those players in that scheme, they get better and better, and you usually have one big year. But when you have roster turnover, now you see all of the rot from where you haven't really been fundamentally developing your program. So I think that's the flip side of why play callers aren't always so successful as head coaches in college. I think it's because they don't dedicate the time to the program. They instead dedicate it to following trends and developing a diversified scheme to fit the personnel they happen to have over a 2 or 3 year span.
Yeah, and we've also seen a lot of these guys head coaches who call their own offensive plays, they have terrible defenses. And it might be implicitly or maybe subconsciously they focus too much on fine-tuning the exact perfect thing of the offense. Lincoln Riley comes to mind. Ryan Day at Ohio State, their defenses have been up and down. Lane Kiffin's, I don't think he's ever fielded a great defense. Petrino had some defensive trouble as well. Maybe you started writing and predicting that John L. Smith was going to do not so great at Arkansas because he took an 8-4 team at Michigan State and turned them into a 4-8 team.
Yeah, I remember seeing that, and combined with the personnel, I was just baffled at media days when they picked like second in the West or whatever that year. It's like, you guys are off your rocker. There was no reason to think that team was going to be that good, but let's move on from there.
All right, let's do a little preview. We're going to do a couple of previews, but let's start with Ohio State. And we have a lot of Ohio State followers who try to make sure that we talk about them and be informed about them. We've both just recently re-reviewed the spring game. We've got some notes, some thoughts there. But before we get into that, Josh, I had a tweet this week because there's been a lot of talk about the quarterback situation at Ohio State. And I think that's easy. It's easy as a fan or as a media person to go straight to quarterback, straight offensive coordinator, straight to defensive coordinator if you've got some turnover in those spots. Alabama's feeling it a little bit this year. Georgia's feeling it a little bit this year. Ohio State. But it's funny because once you get into that echelon of where Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan starting to be there too, have been, it seems like they feel those losses a lot less. And I don't know if it's just because they have good coaching staffs that have good continuity or systems or just talent around them. But for whatever reason, it seems like the replacing a quarterback isn't as devastating to a program that's at the highest heights the next year in. And Ohio State seems to be no different. And I'll note this. I had a tweet about it. I'll show it in the video. And, just for the podcast listeners, give them reel off these numbers. But first-year starters under Ryan Day average 4,100 yards, 9.9 yards per attempt, 45-6 touchdown to interception ratio. The average career pass attempts for that first-year starter coming in is 32, which is nothing. Backup quarterbacks, can come into one game and get 32 pass attempts. The average last three Heisman quarterbacks, 5,000 yards, which includes Joe Burrow's year, 9.6 yards per attempt, which is worse than the first-year starter on Ryan Day, and a 49-6 TD to INT ratio. So these quarterbacks are putting up Heisman-level numbers in their first year as a starter under Ryan Day. And they're not playing in the Big 12. I mean, they're playing some pretty good defenses too. So I want you to talk about this a little bit. Like, yes, there were some concerns in spring game, but we can get into that. But in general, are we getting to a point where the best programs, the programs that have collected the most talent and have the most continuity among staffs, aren't feeling the loss of a highly productive quarterback from the year before and starting a new guy in the next season?
I think to a pretty good extent they are, and I think the reason has to do a lot with the differences in scheme, how much we've talked about with the RPO being kind of a cheat code for offenses. If you have skill position talent that can win one-on-one matchups, the way college football works now, it's a little too easy to get them the ball in space or get them the ball in a one-on-one situation and let them exploit that. Now, the spread has been trending that direction for a long time. Obviously, Urban Meyer was a big spread innovator, but I think there's something even further now in the RPO world, and I talk a lot about how it's kind of taken safeties out of the game. Used to be you watched how the lineman released in the line of scrimmage, you read run pass, and that affected how the defensive secondary reacted to the ball, particularly safeties. Do you crash down or do you back up? They can't really do either now because you can't read the line and determine whether it's a run or pass. They're constantly flat-footed, and that means they can't help the corners. And if you can't help the corners, you're going to get one-on-ones with receivers like Marvin Harrison. If you're a top program, you should be able to recruit high-level receiving talent on a frequent basis. And now in the transfer world, especially if you're in Alabama and you don't have that kind of talent, you go get a Jameson Williams from Ohio State. Ohio State's probably done the best job of any school of maintaining receiver depth. I mean, you can't say enough about the kind of job they do on the receiving core of just making sure they have elite receiving talent. Probably have the best wide receiver coach in the country. Almost certainly have the best wide receiver coach in the country, both from a developmental perspective and a recruiting perspective. And that means that you constantly win those, and you just need an ability of a quarterback to deliver the ball downfield. Now, I will add to that a little bit of an asterisk that I think some of what we're seeing too ties into an earlier conversation we had. And if you're cutting this up, you should go check out the long form. We talked about how NIL and the transfer portal and things have been making it easier, combined with the playoffs and exposure, for big-time programs to recruit at a high level consistently. It didn't used to be the case that if you were an Ohio State or an Alabama, that you would always have a five-star quarterback on the roster. But at this point, that's where we're at. And you have to acknowledge at some level that Dwayne Haskins, Justin Fields, and C.J. Stroud were all elite prospects. And Fields wasn't even a guy that signed with Ohio State out of high school, right? He transfers from Georgia. It's just, if you're one of those programs, you either should have a good quarterback that you recruited, or if you don't, you should be able to get a guy to transfer basically every year. There's no excuse for not having at least good quarterback play. And so if you've got good quarterback play, you can take advantage of the skill position talent. Whereas in prior years, there were times where these teams just had bad quarterbacks. And when you have bad quarterbacks, yeah, you may not be able to get the ball out. That era is gone. And the era of being able to take transfers on the offensive line means you shouldn't have a bad line, etc. So you should always be able to get the ball to those high-level skill position talent players, which means you should always have a good offense and you should always have good quarterback numbers. I think that's just the reality of the world we live in now.
Josh, this is where we get into the spring game a little bit, and I think it's funny. I love talking about spring games and previews because fans, if you follow like message board threads during a spring game, fans are ready to jump off a cliff. It never fails, especially if there's new offensive personnel or new coaches. And I think we had a little bit of both there. Harline got to call the plays in the spring game, but we don't necessarily know if he's going to do that in the regular season. I think not. Maybe it'll be a mixture with Day. But regardless, that probably contributed to a little bit of unevenness. But in general, spring games offensively are a travesty usually. So everything you look at, you have to look at through the lens of all the limitations that are going on spring games, as well as the fact that the coaches don't really care about the score. They don't care about really having great plays for the fans to see. They care about working on specific things, almost like they do in a game where you know against some directional school where the score's kind of ugly in the first half. Coaches are working on stuff. So to that end, it's hard to explain or know what your eyeballs see because just on its surface, the quarterbacks struggled, but in turn, it looked like the defense was playing in a way that I haven't seen them play in a while, especially first-string defensive line, although there seemed to be a pretty big drop-off in the second string. And then in the secondary, I saw better tackling, I saw better coverage. How much of this do we think, from what we saw in the spring game, was improved defense versus maybe some concerns, offensive personnel, or the fact that, you know, Hartline was calling plays, or it was just a spring game and things get ugly?
The first thing I'll note is anytime coaches allow a fairly evenly balanced spring game, you tend to see the defense ahead of the offense. Now, this is a game where, you know, you're not really getting production from Egbuka, Fleming, Henderson, so it really limited, I think, what the offense was able to do, and that starts to have a trickle-down effect when they start rotating players because you end up further down the depth chart. It makes it hard to evaluate. I'm going to try to couch my comments in terms of X unit being ahead of Y unit because I think talking whether someone's good or bad is really hard. I think you can see it in certain skill positions where you see guys that, you know, if you're just missing passes, if you're just not catching the ball, you know, that can be obvious. But in terms of overall units, is the good defense good or the offense good? Is it just the fact that the defense knows what the offense is doing? You know, we'll talk about this probably when we do an Alabama preview later, but I kind of noted if you go back and look at their former spring games, like 2018, one of the most prolific offenses of all time, their offensive stats in that game were garbage. It doesn't really mean a lot more often than not. Sometimes it's just the defense knows what the offense is doing and the offense isn't showing the scheme. I did feel like the first string defensive line was well ahead of the offensive line, and that really, to me, dominated what I saw in the game. McCord never had time to throw. He was running outside the pocket, throwing on the move, having to bail almost every play. Does that mean the defensive line's good, or does it mean the offensive line is bad? I don't know. Is it somewhere in between? Is the offensive line fine and the defensive line just really good? I don't know. I will say the last 2 years, Ohio State's had 3 offensive tackles taken in the first 4 rounds, 1 taken in the first round last year. Those are the first offensive tackles Ohio State's had taken in the first round since Decker in the 2015 draft, or 2016 draft from the 2015 season. So you really had the best set of offensive tackles that you'd had in like 7 years in that group. there's going to be turnover probably at tackles. It's probably fair to assume that what you got in the spring is not as good as it was previously. I generally assume that a unit that was really good last year probably is really good this year, and a unit that wasn't necessarily dominant last year probably shouldn't be dominant in the spring game. So in that regard, I do think the offensive line is in rebuilding mode. That's not unique for any team in the spring. I don't think there's been a huge emphasis on cohesion for Ohio State in the spring. Like most teams, they're trying to play with different personnel, rotating guys around. It's not shocking. But what I will say is that to me, it dominated the viewpoint. For the first string offense, McCord was almost never able to stand in the pocket and throw on rhythm, which meant he didn't really look great throwing the football. I thought a lot of balls were kind of sailing on him, but they're sailing on him because he's throwing off his back foot. I don't know if that means anything for the season. In the same way, the defensive backs I thought looked a lot better, but when Harrison was the target, he was open by 5 yards almost every time. Is that just Harrison being Harrison, or is it indicative of the fact that without Egbuka and Fleming, maybe the receivers just weren't up to the level they have been the past couple of years? Again, you're talking about guys that aren't going to play, so it's not a big deal. But maybe that made the DBs look better than they are. I think in that way, like Carnell Tate stood out. Maybe that's an indication that the DBs are slightly improved from last year, but the fact that they look so much better had a lot to do with the receivers they're going against. I think you can take almost anything you want out of a spring game. It's why I often don't really love doing previews, because it's, I think, painfully difficult to do. If you're not just talking about who's replacing who on the line of scrimmage and whatnot. And even then, we include Smoke Bowie in our Georgia preview because we record, and by the time we actually edit and get the video out, the guy's no longer on the team. So that happens a lot. We're always going to be out of date. We'll probably get something wrong because there's never any good place to get all this information. And when we're doing research, somebody will have it written wrong and we'll transcribe the error. But I do think Ohio State's probably not going to be as good offensively. I think there's the potential for the offensive line to cause more problems. I think let me say this, if the quarterback struggles, I think it's going to be more likely the offensive line, which hasn't been phenomenal even with really good talent, is having issues like Alabama had in 2021, than it is really the quarterback changeover problem. And with that same token, it won't shock me if the defense, which seems to be more of a point of emphasis the past couple of years, going into a second year with a new coordinator, if they take a big step forward. So what does it mean for Ohio State as a football team? That's the difficult question, and one that we'll guess at, but I don't think we can give a particularly good or sound answer.
And for me, I think that there's some good and bad in Ohio State's schedule and the way it lines up. So, Georgia, historically, when they've played their big name out-of-conference opponent, it's been the first game of the year. Clemson, Oregon last year, it's that first game. And if you're breaking in a new quarterback, new offensive line, potentially new play caller, that's tough. And, a lot of teams, I think that's why they schedule that big out-of-conference game in week 2, is because they want to at least have some kind of live game action against a cupcake to really get that going. Well, they play Notre Dame in their 4th game, Ohio State, this year. It's at Notre Dame, which is tough. And they open at Indiana, which Indiana's not been a great team, but you're opening on the road. You get 2 cupcakes, and then you go on the road again for Notre Dame. So your first 2 Power 5 games, including Notre Dame in that, are on the road. That's tough. But, it's double-edged because you also have 3 games, unless Indiana turns out to be really good, 3 games to warm your quarterback up, where if you play Notre Dame in week 1, you might not, the things that you iron out over the first 3 weeks, you don't get that luxury of ironing those out. You don't get that luxury of experience as a starter to get some of that rhythm to work through some things until you get there. The other problem is, after Notre Dame, they've got Maryland at home, but then at Purdue, then Penn State at home, then at Wisconsin. And then right before Michigan this year, they've got Minnesota, who's been a good football team. So the other double-edged side of this, Josh, we talked about Alabama and Georgia, East and West. And Alabama has what seems to be, you never know going into the season, what seems to be a much tougher schedule. But there's an upside to that for Alabama versus Georgia, in that Georgia has no margin for error in the SEC championship game. Alabama can maybe take a loss and win the SEC and still make the playoffs. Ohio State, like last year, has a schedule that's tough enough that they can take a loss, potentially even to Michigan, always based on what everybody else does, and still make the playoffs. And I think that that's probably a big possibility given that this schedule looks pretty tough, at least on paper. Talk a little bit about what might be concerning for a fan, but really is a little bit of a luxury of having a very tough schedule in a season where you are breaking in a lot of new faces, giving you that margin for error.
I think there are good and bad sides to it, because if you're going to drop a game stupidly, you'd rather do it in a tough schedule year, because then you get more benefit of the doubt for the loss, right? It's more easily excused. Obviously, it makes it harder because if you have a dumb game, it's more likely to be against a team that can beat you. It's kind of a turnaround for a big complaint a lot of Big Ten teams have had with certain SEC teams for years, which is, oh yeah, Texas A&M is ranked in the top 25. They haven't beaten a top 25 team. Now they're excused because they lost entirely to top 10 teams. It was a few years ago, right, where they played 4 top 10 teams. I think 4 top 5 teams, and they're an 8-4 team that's ranked like 21st. Well, what do you do about that, right? And sometimes losing to elite teams will excuse the fact that maybe you didn't beat anybody that was elite. And Ohio State may be a little bit in that world, right? You can drop a game or two, and it's going to be pretty excusable given how difficult the schedule is if you lose to the right teams. You lose to a 10-win Notre Dame team, and let's say you lose to, Penn State. Well, maybe you turn around and beat Michigan. You may win the conference. You may be a 2-loss team winning the conference. You only lost to top teams. You beat top teams. You win the Big Ten. You might end up in the playoff. So I think this is maybe a year where, Ohio State benefits from it. Certainly is always more likely to lose games, but now that we're in the playoff world where losses are more excusable, it used to be a BCS world, right, where if you lost a game, you were probably out. So that's why it was so crippling. But now you don't necessarily get knocked out of the playoff. And the more it expands, the more that's going to be the case. That I think a difficult schedule doesn't really hurt you too much. And in some instances, if you got a lot of really hard games, it can actually help you, because you're not going to lose one. You're not going to lose the Purdue game that just knocks you out entirely. Their opponents should be good enough this year that their losses are going to be a lot more excusable than they were that year in 2017.
Well, let me turn something around to you really quick as we close out Ohio State. There's so much focus this year on the quarterback, on the offense, and I get it, especially if you see an ugly spring game or you don't know with McCord coming in, he's not like Tua at Alabama in 2018 or even Bryce Young, who had a lot of reps as a backup and you already knew what you were going to get. We don't really know what we're going to see with McCord, but I would argue that really none of that matters. Ohio State can even take a step back offensively this year and win as many or more games compared to last year, assuming they do the thing that they haven't really been able to do of late, and that's get the defense in order. Josh, since 2020, in their big games, so either, let's say top 10 opponents, Penn State, playoff games, Michigan, that sort of thing, they average giving up 41 points per game on defense. And we've always said that in these big games, a lot of times offenses tend to, even elite offenses versus elite defenses, offenses generally win. And it happens to be in this kind of RPO crazy era. But still, 41 points per game ain't going to get it done. By the way, if they gave up 42 points against Georgia, give up 40 in that game, and you got a national championship trophy to hold on to. So, Josh, is this a situation where it really doesn't matter how good the offense is this year? We know they're not going to fall off a cliff. It really, if they want to get to where they want to go, where Ohio State right now, the standard is winning a championship, it's really going to come down to whether or not they can shore up the defense in this season.
I think that's probably a fair estimation. And, you can go ahead and look in the comments for everybody that's already commented. But I know I said 17 was Purdue, but that was Iowa with the big loss. So I corrected myself, but I'm sure people have already commented. The reality in a lot of those seasons is that people complain about all kinds of different parts of the team, or the offense wasn't doing that well. 17, the offense doesn't show up. 18, they don't show up against Purdue. Now, the problem in those games is you had no business giving up the points you gave up, right? Iowa put up 55, I think, in that game in 2017. Scoring 24 points against a team like Iowa, and yeah, they were better that year, but they still weren't that great, should be enough to at least make it a close game, if not give you a chance to win. Ohio State has had a problem with giving up a lot of points in big games or in difficult situations. I think some of that was due to the old coordinator, and I think you can probably safely pin a lot of that on the coordinator situation that they were in a few years ago. We talked about, right, that loss to Oregon was a big example. The 2020 season, when they lost so badly to Alabama in the national title game, we talked about it. They had a defensive scheme that was designed to sort of dominate teams that had inferior talent, but they frequently ran one safety. They frequently didn't really have good edge containment. And if you were playing a team that could block you well enough to extend time, and they had receivers that could win one-on-one battles, it was way too easy in the RPO era to get guys downfield on one-on-one shots and have high scores. And I think sometimes we focus on the, like the Iowa game where you get blown out, or Indiana a few years ago with Penix. We miss the times where maybe they did shut somebody down. But I think what would happen is if you played a team that was clicking, and things were working well, that defensive scheme it just wasn't going to stop somebody that's clicking. I think we've seen it with Georgia the past few years. As dominant as they've been defensively, when they played a high-level team that was clicking offensively, they gave up points. They gave up a lot of points most every time. I'm hoping the new scheme for Ohio State turns it around. I'm hoping the fact that they've gotten a little more willing to say, look, if you try to shut somebody down, if you're that aggressive, and when I say aggressive, I don't just mean in play call. I think sometimes I really mean more formationally and how close you play to the line of scrimmage and how tight you play people. You open yourself up to explosive plays. And in the RPO era, well-executed explosive plays can be almost unstoppable. So everybody is now playing back. Everybody's playing with more safeties. People are not trying to be as dominant defensively. Georgia's played in that world, and it's worked for them, and it's gotten them burned. But they've been good enough to overcome it. Nobody else really has the defensive talent they have to play that game. And again, I think the problem for opponents playing Georgia is always more talented than you. Ohio State last year is really maybe the only exception to that. Everybody else, you don't have the overall talent level they have defensively, so they can play aggressive and they can win. So I think maybe you take a step back schematically. You're going to give up more points on maybe something of a regular basis. But you do that because you want to be more sound when you play a high-level team and they take those RPO shots. You always make sure you have safety help. And they've gotten in a lot of games where they have to make that adjustment and they're not comfortable and everything just sort of goes to pieces. So I think it's been a problem for them, but I think it's been a schematic issue. And I think with the transition that they've made a defensive coordinator, that's something that maybe is going to start to get shored up. I think Knowles is just a big-time improvement for them, and I think every Ohio State fan knows it. I think maybe fans of other teams know it, but it's a long-time conversion. When you go change defensive coordinators, it usually takes a couple of years, and I think this may be the year where we really start to see it.
All right, so to wrap these up, what I've been doing is really having us pick what we want the season, what we think the final record might look like in the regular season, or over under, and I'm gonna set the over for Ohio State, over under for Ohio State to 10.5, and I'm gonna pick the under. And I know I called my shot last week and I had Ohio State in the playoffs. Looking more at the schedule, I see two paths for Ohio State. I see one where they're just dominant because they have that kind of 3-game buffer to get everything rolling. I think the first half of the season is going to be, can you work out the wrinkles on offense? And I think the second half of the season is going to be, have you gotten better on defense? Both of those are question marks for me. Until I see something with my eyes, and that's why we don't start our model until week 4. Until I see something with my eyes, I can't overlook how brutal this schedule is. And people don't realize, SEC fans are going to be like, Purdue, Maryland, Wisconsin, that's not brutal. It is brutal in its totality. It is brutal in there may not be 5 top 10 teams on there, but every week they play a team that is reasonably schemed and reasonably talented. And when you have 3 or 4 of those in a row, it's really tough. So I think Ohio State might be a better team this year than last year, but their schedule to me is really tough. And so for that reason, I'm going under 10.5. Josh, give me yours and we'll wrap it.
I think they probably finish 11-1. It's again, most teams it's safer to pick 11-1 than undefeated. Undefeated seasons are just rare in general. If you have a 95% chance to win every game, you're going to drop a game. I think that Ohio State is in that rarefied air where only certain teams could really challenge them. I think that I'm going to push back a little bit when you talk about schedule difficulty. We talk about this with strength of schedule all the time. There's difficulty to make a bowl, and there's difficulty to make the playoff, right? Sagarin measures difficulty to make the bowl. How difficult is it going to go to be going 6-6? How many tough games are on the schedule, tough for a reasonably good team? Doesn't necessarily mean it's a difficult schedule to go 11-1, right? If you play 9 games against a junior high team and 3 games against NFL teams, it's really easy to go to a bowl. It's really hard to make the playoff. I think this Ohio State schedule is hard to make a bowl, but I don't know that there are as many killers on it as could be. And that's where the SEC Big Ten beef's going to come. And the reason for that, I don't necessarily buy that Notre Dame's going to turn everything around. Indiana's been on a downswing. I don't think Maryland is just at that talent level. Purdue, same boat. Wisconsin, Rutgers, Michigan State have all been sort of floating into the somewhat good but not really elite level. Minnesota. And then Michigan and Penn State, I think we have concerns over Penn State. Probably won't do a preview, but I'll note Drew Aller was a 5.7 yard per attempt guy last year. Maybe he can turn out to be a better player than we expect, but I've got concerns with him and that offense. They haven't really been able to live up to high expectations every year they've had them. And then Michigan is going to be a game that Ohio State has circled. And all they got to do is split Penn State and Michigan if everything else is a pretty winnable game for them. And 11-1 is on the table. So I think I would take the over. I think Ohio State can be a quite good team and make the playoff or go 11-1. It depends on who they lose to and who wins the Big Ten. I think the schedule is consistently difficult and you can't have an off week, a total bust off week. But if you're really a high level, close to elite level team and talent, you really should go a minimum of 10-2 against this schedule, I think. And so it's kind of a weird in between. That's my prediction.
All right, that's it for Ohio State preview. Y'all, just want to do a quick call out, and please share this preview. We're going to do a cut up. Obviously, it's going to be part of our full weekly show, but share this wherever you talk Ohio State football. Sign up for the newsletter, collegefootballnerds.com, and we look forward to talking with y'all throughout the season. All right, Josh, let's get into Alabama preview. We talked about Ohio State today, and they're replacing quarterback that put up huge numbers last year and got some question marks on the offensive side of the ball. This year, everybody's coming to Alabama with, hilariously, they are missing this player, and they're having to replace all these players and coaches, as if Alabama hasn't had to do that almost every year throughout Nick Saban's tenure. I put out a stat on Twitter that mentioned 4 of Alabama's 6. The stat was wrong. I said 5, but I think it's 4 of 6 Alabama national championships have come under Nick Saban with a first-year starting quarterback. Now, there haven't been a lot of years where they're replacing starting quarterback, offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. I think there's 2 things that we need to think about here. One is a given. Alabama reloads. A lot of these teams, Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, getting to be Michigan, they reload. They don't rebuild ever. So there's that piece of it that I think is a given. The other piece, though, where I think there are some question marks if you're not really close to this Alabama program, there's question marks around how can you replace your quarterback, your offensive coordinator, and your defensive coordinator and be remotely good or remotely ready for an SEC schedule. Josh, maybe this is a little bit more for the non-Alabama fans, and maybe the Alabama fans want to hear it. my contention is, and maybe you agree, the coordinators both are addition by subtraction. Not necessarily bad coordinators, but bad fits for the college game and for what they want to do at Alabama.
Well, it really parallels a lot of what we just talked about with Ohio State, right? That Knowles, as a coordinator, has really done a lot to improve the defensive side of the football. I don't think there's many Alabama fans that have been happy with their coordinators the last 2 years. And it's funny because in a lot of statistical metrics, Alabama's been really good, right? If you talk about who's the leader in the SEC last year in yard per play defense, it's Alabama by a substantial margin over Georgia. The best pass defense in the SEC was Alabama. I think they were like third in the country. Georgia was 23rd. Yard per attempt defense. So there were a lot of statistical categories defensively where they were really good, but I don't think they were viewed as being very good. And I think the reason is when push came to shove, they tended to get shoved. And Georgia was a better scoring defense by a significant margin than Alabama. I think around 14 versus 18 points per game. So I think when you look at everything from Alabama as an outsider's perspective, you know things have fallen off. But it's all a little weird because in a lot of statistics, metrics, and those metrics, again, are just straight up how much yards are they given, how tough is the defense. They've held their own, but the production hasn't come, and I think the consistency hasn't come. And last year in particular, it was a weird situation where Alabama's offense and defense couldn't be good at the same time, and they wouldn't both ever be bad at the same time. LSU game, they started the game with 4 straight 3-and-outs, I believe, and the defense just so happened that completely held, and I think they gave up 1 score from LSU in that period. Then the offense started to turn around, and then LSU started to score. And the same kind of thing happened in the Texas game. Same kind of thing happened somewhat in reverse in the Tennessee game. It just, they haven't had the consistency needed to dominate anyone. And last year, I think they had more 1-score, 2-score games in a year than they'd had in like 5 years previously, because both sides of the ball just weren't getting it done. And I'll say on the offensive side of the ball, we were always pretty critical of O'Brien. They started last year with a lot of 2 tight end stuff, even though their tight end was hurt, which really baffled me. It didn't work. They tried to be pro style. I don't think it worked. They tried to have complicated play calls where Bryce Young was adjusting the line of scrimmage. Well, it meant they were always snapping the ball late in road environments where it's difficult to get the snap off. I think it was at times devastating to them. And I think they've always put too much on Bryce Young. And rather than accepting that, yeah, there's some really easy plays anybody can make that can score a lot of points, they just said, well, we got a great quarterback, so let's make him be Tom Brady in a college world where you don't have to be Tom Brady. And on top of all that, there's areas we've been more critical than a lot of Alabama fans have liked. We've talked about the fact that I think Bryce Young's height was a limitation. I think Nick Saban's even hinted at that. They tried to focus on things he did well, which is why they didn't do the RPO. I think he has trouble throwing over the line of scrimmage and those slant RPO patterns. He just has a hard time getting the ball and quickly getting it out over a lineman's head to a receiver, and it kind of took a big part of the playbook out that they'd like to run. There may be some issues where even though the players are worse, the team might actually be better, and it's due to the coordinators, it's due to changes in personnel, maybe a better fit for what they're trying to do. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't jump to the conclusion that they're a worse team. And I'll give a thought and let you respond to it. It's always interesting to me when you talk about Alabama's championship years, right? You mentioned that 4 of the 6 titles came with a first-year quarterback. I think they've also come in years where they replaced a lot of what were perceived to be their biggest key players, right? 2011, maybe the most dominant Alabama team. They lose Marcel Darius. They lose Julio Jones. It was kind of this big-time exodus of their star players, their quarterback, their wide receiver, their defensive linemen, that were what made them, right? Mark Ingram, Heisman Trophy winner's gone. And they turned around and were a much more dominant team in 11 than they were 10 because the core of the team got older and they fixed a lot of holes. You can make the argument, same thing, I think, from 2008 to 2009, lost their starting quarterback. Lose a lot of their best defensive players. You can make the argument like 2014 to 2015. They lose Amari Cooper, lose their starting quarterback, go to the guy that wasn't good enough to start in 2014. Lost a lot of big defensive players. We're a better football team. So this has happened a lot through history with Alabama. People point to recruiting, the ability to reload, and I think that's part of it. But I think it also really just speaks to the fact that college football is more about the core of your team than the players you know in a lot of cases. And we often focus on teams that replace the quarterback or they replace the star running back. And we miss the fact of like, yeah, but their offensive line is going to get better, which I think is probably going to be the case for Alabama. The defensive line is going to get better. Probably be the case compared to where they were at the end of last year. We can talk about all these issues. So, with these high-level talent teams, I think these things are a lot more complicated. And Alabama, people don't remember it due to hindsight, but they've often won their titles and exceeded expectations in years where they were expected to be kind of reloading and be in a bit of an off year.
Yeah, and look, I think that we've talked about this a lot from a personnel standpoint, in that, if you had a lot of guys drafted high and you didn't perform well on the field, you can point to coaching staffs. And when there's turnover there, it might be reason for optimism. I think that this Alabama team last year, and to some extent 21, other than getting hot late, this 2022 Alabama team is reflective of a coaching staff that did not have the DNA of previous staffs at Alabama. The hallmark of Alabama through this run has been that they dominate teams that aren't elite. Like, even top 25 teams. If you're the 14th team in the country, come to Tuscaloosa, take your 30-point beating, and go home. That's been Alabama. And it's you could see it in not just how they scheme and how they operate, but how the players play on the field. And you heard the locker room talk from Will Anderson and the being intimidated when they went to Neyland Stadium and things like that, or anxiety. I don't remember what the word was. To me, a lot of room for optimism for Alabama this year is looking at really how poorly they played in wins last year, because it wasn't Alabama. In spite of having all that talent, they were doing the same things over and over again. The checks at the line, the one D lineman, formations on defense. Alabama had close games that they had no business playing close games. Texas, when yours went down, they should have dominated that game. Alabama scored 20 points. In 7 of the next 9 games Texas played with that schedule, they still gave up at least 20 points. And I'm talking to like directional, non-P5 teams. Auburn, 10-horned Alabama on the ground. They had a quarterback who couldn't throw it in the ocean from a boat. Robbie Ashford was terrible in that game. 77 yards passing. They still put up 318 on the ground. These are not what you expect from an Alabama team, and you can't say it wasn't because they weren't talented enough. If they had all the talent in the world and they were underperforming in these wins, the Ole Miss game was close. The A&M game was close. These are games that showed both of us, one, they had no business in the playoffs. They didn't earn their right in the playoffs. You can't take the Kansas State data point and the championship game TC data point and then say, see, a month earlier you should have put Alabama in the playoffs. It doesn't work like that. The team that Alabama put on the field consistently throughout the season was not the team that belonged in the playoffs, and it's not the team we saw against Kansas State. And to your point, I think one of the biggest issues for Alabama, or the biggest issue for Alabama in the last couple of seasons, has been this thing where the defense and the offense can't be good at the same time. That's what's prevented them from having the type of games where they're consistently dominant against even good teams. The other thing that you noted is the 3-and-outs. The 3-and-outs are so damaging, they're like turnovers. Alabama had more 3-and-outs in 2022 than they've had combined under Nick Saban. Combined. So I think that those two things reflect coaching, and that's where I want to get into a little bit more of coaching and the exact maybe scheme considerations that we're going to see in Tuscaloosa this year. Josh, even if Bill O'Brien technically is a better offensive coordinator, is it possible that without Bryce Young and with maybe definitely less experience, but maybe not even as good of an pure offensive coordinator in Tommy Rees, is it possible that we see a much better offense, at least from a scoring and efficiency standpoint, in Tuscaloosa this year?
Certainly, it's certainly possible, and there are various reasons to think that. One, I think if they just go to a more just RPO quarterback-friendly scheme, they could get more points just by default. There's no reason to go 3-and-out 4 times in a row in modern college football. It's way, way too difficult to defend even a lot of base plays from a college offense if you have a high level of talent. And when you have a Heisman quarterback, it's really inexcusable, which says there's just something wrong with the scheme. And you point a lot to, like, I think O'Brien was almost a lot like Jimbo Fisher. He was trying to do things that in theory can work really well, but there's no reason you need to do it. And I think in a lot of ways it's easier for other teams to scheme and defend. One interesting factoid that we put on Twitter is Alabama only actually has 4 top 100 offensive skill players on their roster from their 2020 and 2021 classes. So that's you want to think of it like the junior, senior classes. There are only 4 top 100 skill players on the roster. There are 12 top 100 skill players in their freshman and sophomore classes. That's the guys that were freshmen last year and the guys they just signed. So there's a lot of young talent. In fact, I think a lot of people, when they evaluate Alabama and they look at, returning starters, I noticed just on the one I've got in front of me, like Kobe Prentice isn't listed as a returning starter, but I know for a fact from having watched him, he was essentially one of their starting receivers. At times probably, from what I saw, seemed to be their best receiver last year. I don't think many people understand how much of kind of a hole there was in a lot of their roster, and even though they had a Heisman QB, I think people knew the receiving core was down, but I don't think they realized that it was kind of a weird deal where last year where there were a lot of freshmen that were coming in, Bond and Prentice and all these guys that were young guys were starting to look like their best receivers, and they were their best receivers even in the bowl game. So if they take a scheme that just lets those guys play and lets them, use their own skill, they had a prolific offense with Blake Sims in 2014, and Blake Sims couldn't make a Canadian football roster. Great player. He did great things for them as a football team. Wasn't a high-level QB talent. And he was really a lot more effective than they had probably in a lot of ways with A.J. McCarron in 2013, who had a much more inconsistent offense. What happened? Changed offensive coordinator, did a better job of leveraging the skill position talent around the quarterback. So there's precedence for those changes. And, I wasn't quite sure where I'd fit this in, so I'll go ahead and note it. And you talk like top level draft picks, right? And overall turnover. They lost a lot of high level guys because they lost 3 guys in the first round. They had 4 guys drafted in the first 2 rounds. That's, a relatively low number for Alabama. It's about as few as they've had. In fact, if you want to look for fewer guys drafted in the first round, I'm looking back, 2015 is the year, I think. So since the end of the 2014 season, that was as few first 2 round guys as they've had in a long time. They lost a lot of quality guys. A lot of guys had a lot of time in the program, particularly in the defensive side of the ball. We haven't even talked about it. A lot of guys 4th, 5th, 6th rounds, but they weren't the first rounders they were used to, weren't the second rounders. They were replaceable guys, and in a new scheme that does a better job of using high level talent, there's a lot of reason to think they could be successful.
So we haven't talked much about the defensive side of the ball. And I think that the big highlight is you lose Will Anderson, so you're definitely going to have a drop-off. I don't necessarily know that that's correct either, because I think that he was used he wasn't used to his full advantage in the scheme that he played in last year. I think that people are going to be surprised at how much quality, probably depth they have on the defensive line. The secondary is going to be ridiculous, in my opinion. But the question, Josh, is does Alabama have the pieces to improve? Their biggest challenge offensively was 3 and outs, but their biggest challenge defensively was getting off the field. And maybe that's somewhat due to the fact that they were tired because the offense kept giving the ball back to the other offense. But also in general, maybe schematically, there were some problems there. In your opinion, do you think that we'll see a return for this Alabama team to a team that can get off the field on 3rd down? Or is this something that with modern offenses that it's never going to be great?
I do think it's something that's never going to be great. But what was striking is that Alabama couldn't get off the field on 3rd down against inferior teams. I was the one that put together the video of the 1D lineman on the field against LSU. That was our soapbox and something we flagged. I'll note they did that even later in the year. The Auburn game, there's a play where Robbie Ashford runs a quarterback draw from like the 14-yard line, or just carries it. It's hard to tell. There was a draw and a carry at different points, and they had one defensive lineman on the field, and they scored on a 3rd and goal from the 14. So they did that kind of stuff a lot. And I know there was a conversion, which was a similar situation. 3rd and long, 1 D lineman on the field. And in those cases, they had 3 outside linebackers. Our big complaint in the LSU game is they pulled a defensive lineman for a DB, but they kept 2 inside linebackers, so they blitzed 5 guys, 1 D lineman on the nose. They had 2 outside linebackers on each guard, and they had 2 inside linebackers on the tackle, which meant all across the formation, everybody was outmanned. And so the LSU got a lot of push, and Jaden Daniels had that big run in the 4th quarter that set him up, put him in a position to be able to tie in the game. If Alabama just doesn't do stupid stuff, I think they have a potential to be better. And even then, I want to be fair to the coordinators. I think there were some personnel issues. So after we put that video out, and I don't know if Alabama staff watched us, or I'm sure it really was just them self-evaluating those problems, they went with a lot more 3-man fronts. The Ole Miss game was the first one where I noticed it, where they'd have 3 defensive linemen on the field and 1 outside linebacker. And they really struggled against the run against Ole Miss. They tried it against Auburn and had the same issues. And the reason was that their inside linebacker play wasn't great. And I think Tuotoa was not the guy any of us expected to be. We expected a 1st, 2nd round guy, and we got a 5th round guy. Again, there were a lot of projections for Alabama last year that I think we still haven't quite acknowledged. They didn't quite pan out. They were borderline, mid-tier, borderline NFL players. They were not NFL stars like we expected. But the off linebacker, who was Moody or Lawson, never knew how to set the edge for them. And I think they were so built around using so many outside linebackers with Anderson and Turner, and then they have Braswell as the 3rd guy who's going to step in as a starter this year, that when they went back to a more normal scheme, they were super uncomfortable. And I would watch teams run sweeps. Ole Miss and Auburn both would run sweeps to the strong side of the formation, would run opposite Will Anderson as much as they could, and the linebackers could never get out in front of it. They were always getting pinned inside, and the running back would come out. And that's just fundamental football. It's about not knowing how to run a base defense. They're going to fix that. And I think when they fix those issues, they're going to be a better team. I think they've got enough young talent to be better. Moody, who left them, he was a senior player, wasn't a great player. He didn't have a lot of high-level athleticism. Lawson, who's going to start this year, when he played, he thought he was better, but he was clearly playing injured. He missed all spring with an injury. I think they're going to be a more sound team. I think they're going to have last year I think they had a couple players at safety, at linebacker, that were weaknesses and holes. And because of how strained their scheme was, we talked about this with Tennessee. Tennessee could put a guy in motion in a split formation, and they knew they were going to, 1, they could draw an outside linebacker into coverage, and 2, they knew they could get a one-on-one with a safety. I don't think Alabama's going to be as predictable. I think they're going to do a better job of keeping corners on top of receivers, not exposing safeties. I think they're going to be more sound in the back 7. It's a funny thing to me when you look at LSU and Alabama. LSU's this trendy pick. LSU has a lot of turnover on the defensive side of the ball. They've brought in a lot of transfers to shore up the secondary. Alabama not only have a lot of talent, but they've brought in some really high-level transfers, and it's weird to me that they get no credit for that, right? That clearly are trying to fill up deficiencies and make sure they're sound on the back end, and we kind of feel like Alabama's going to be shaky, and we just assume LSU's going to plug and play, even though we know Alabama's returning guys are pretty good. So it seems to me like Alabama's almost certainly going to be solid, and LSU's the one that should be the bigger question. I still haven't figured that out yet from a national perspective, but I do think there's every reason to think they're going to turn things around and be a more solid, especially on the defensive side of the ball, a more solid football team.
Funny that we're talking about a team turning things around that went 11-2 last year, but for Alabama standards, that's where we're at. I want to end this by talking about the schedule, because really going into last season, nobody, not us, not anybody in the national media, nobody really appreciated the challenge of the home road splits and how they lined up for Alabama last year. It was brutal. And you've got Auburn at home, that's the big game at the end of the year, but Auburn wasn't that good. You had to go on the road to Tennessee. You had to go on the road to LSU. This year, you had to go on the road to Texas, 137 degrees and 130,000 people. This year, it's much more favorable for Alabama from that respect. So you got Texas in Tuscaloosa. You've got Arkansas, who I think is going to be a good team. They have a brutal schedule on their own, and it won't show up in the win-loss column. That's going to be a very good team this year. Tennessee's at home, LSU's at home, and those are all in a row. At Kentucky, at Auburn. There's the one game at Texas A&M that I think might be a challenge for Alabama. I'm on the record saying I think Texas A&M is going to be much improved this year. We're doing this thing where we're doing the over-under for the teams. I'm setting the over-under at 10.5. Josh, I'll go first. I think it's over. I do think they lose a game. And I don't think the loss comes Tennessee or LSU. Here's where I think it happens. This is the stretch after Texas and then in South Florida. They've got Ole Miss and then at Miss State, at A&M versus Arkansas all in a row. That's a tough stretch. It's not, there's not an elite team in there, but that's 4 quality teams. They get a bye week before Tennessee, or it will be super brutal because then it's Tennessee and LSU. I think somewhere in that stretch, Alabama drops a game because I don't think there's going to be a monster this year like a 2020 Alabama, 2019 LSU. I do think they win the West. I think they go 11-1. I think they drop a weird game in that rough stretch. Give me your over or under 10.5 games for Alabama.
I lean over. I think that probably is the right number. I know it's Vegas's number. I was just checking it. It really depends a lot on the quarterback situation and how quickly that develops. So last year, they started with Texas in week 2. They really struggled in that game. Now, Texas ended up leading the country in quarterback pressures, I believe, last season, which I think a lot of Alabama fans let that fly under the radar. That's been their problem. The last few years, the offensive line hasn't always held up. And I feel like Bryce Young as a player has some particular weaknesses if there's a really crowded line of scrimmage. And so it all kind of compounded. Texas has a lot of turnover, so I don't necessarily see that being the same challenge at home for Alabama this season. It was a team that's very much led by their best players, I think, and when guys got banged up, they weren't always nearly as good of a football team. So I'll kind of believe it when I see it there. But through the rest of the schedule, like you said, that September through October gauntlet's really hard, and it's probably going to determine the answer to this question. And really, for them to make it through that gauntlet, they're going to have solid quarterback play, right? And that's the thing we haven't touched on at length. I do think Milroe last year in the Texas A&M game, look, that was his first start against what was a very good defense, one of the, I think, if not the top, probably the best pass defense in the SEC, one of the best in the country. Weren't a very good run defense, and everybody looks at the quarterback situation in that game, and I've always said, well, the problem for Alabama is they didn't run the ball. Appalachian State beat them because they ran all over them. Alabama's got to be better on the offensive line. I think they will be, but they've got to get a quarterback to complement it. And if they can get the quarterback play
Josh,
together,
do they need elite quarterback play? Because you said good quarterback play. Do they need elite quarterback?
I don't think it has to be elite. It just has to be good. If they drop a game, it's almost certainly, in my opinion, going to be a situation where the quarterback is a disaster. If you think back to, you can check my math on this, but I believe the 2009 Alabama game where Terrence Cody blocked the field goal to win the game. The thing people forget about that game, it was Greg McElroy's first year starting, and I want to say it had a total implosion. I think they threw like 4 interceptions in that game. A lot of cases where Alabama's dropped games, it's because the quarterback play has been awful. When they lost to Ole Miss in 2014, that was a game where Blake Sims showed that he was a below average quarterback. I think they worked miracle with him because from a quarterback perspective, he really wasn't a solid passer. They need solid to get through that conflict. They don't need elite. If they get good, they can win those by a significant margin, I think. But they need, at minimum, solid. And evaluating that's tough. I will say the spring game did not look good, but a lot like Ohio State, the story to me in the spring is the left tackle for the first team offense, when I went back and watched it, was just getting mauled. So Milroe, who was a starting quarterback, had a terrible day. Same way McCord at Ohio State. They have 2 new offensive tackles. They weren't gelled. Their offensive line got mauled the whole spring, and their passing statistics weren't great. But at the same time, I went back and looked at prior spring games for Alabama. You look at like 2018, Jalen Hurts was 19 of 37 for 195 yards. You look at 2019, before they really exploded as a passing offense. Mediocre spring game. 2017, mediocre spring game. It's been a trend for Alabama for years that they don't put the offense in a position to succeed. So I think it's just a question. If they get solid QB play, if the offensive line is improved, which I think it will be, they've got the talent on the roster finally to turn that around. The interior offensive line, people talk about the tackles. The interior offensive line has got no push for them for years. They're going to be a solid core, and they've got to have good, but they've got to be good enough at quarterback where week 4 to week 8, which is when quarterbacks are figuring things out, that they don't have an absolute dud against a team that's playing a good football game. And if they can do that, they'll put them in a position to make it to the end of the year with one more loss and possibly win the division, have a chance to beat Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. If they don't turn that around fast enough, then they may drop a game early. And if they drop a game early, the end of the year is such a, I think, like you said, if you look at just the second half, at A&M, Arkansas, Tennessee, LSU, at Auburn, it's hard to make it through that without one loss. So if you lose one early, you're probably going to drop a second late.
Greg McElroy, who follows us on Twitter, is going to get you for that 2009 Tennessee-Alabama game where he had no interceptions. He only had 120 yards passing, but he had no interceptions. Okay. The 4 interception game was the 2015 Ole Miss game, the crazy tip interception or catch. I think there were a lot of 4 turnovers in that game.
Well, I will interject and say I think McElroy is probably gracious enough to acknowledge that he maybe didn't have the best game, even if I had the stats wrong. But it was 4.1 yards per attempt, so that's my 4 number came from in my head. But the point to me with Sims and McElroy both, they weren't bad quarterbacks for Alabama. But in that week 4 to week 6 gauntlet with a first-year starter, the quarterbacks that haven't been high-level NFL talents have often had a game where they were just really struggled when they first hit the meat of the conference schedule. Sometimes, like I think Sims lit up Florida before he turned around and had a dud against Ole Miss. So that's really what I'm flagging. The quarterbacks need to be solid enough that they don't have an absolute dud, because then they're going to drop a game in that gauntlet. And if they're solid enough, if they find one guy that can play at a decent enough level, he's probably going to have a rough game, but it won't be so rough that it'll cost them the win, and they'll find a way to pull it out like Alabama did in 2009.
But no, I'm totally with you. I don't think they need elite quarterback, but they need good, consistent quarterback play. They need to avoid 3-and-out city. That's a wrap for us on this 2023 season Alabama preview. Got a lot more coming this preseason. Obviously, this is a cut-up if you're watching just the cut-up for the Alabama preview, but we do a full episode where we just talk ball. We do previews. We talk about other topics around college football. So keep an eye out. You can go to our YouTube page and see it there, or just listen to the full podcast version. Check out the website, collegefootballnerds.com. Sign up for the newsletter. We got some more stuff in store that's stats related that you're going to want to get into throughout the regular season. We haven't released it yet. We haven't announced it yet, but it's coming. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.